Settler colonialism is a form of colonialism that occurs in three stages. The first stage, conquest and displacement, in which a foreign entity invades a territory already under occupation, displacing, murdering, and committing genocide against the indigenous populace. The second stage, replacement and settlement, where colonists arrive and settle on the recently acquired land and bring with them a new culture and social system. They begin to transform the land in order to suit their needs. The third stage, consolidation and assimilation, where settlers establish a new country in the region and firmly establish a new nation, complete with a new national identity based on settler consciousness. The indigenous are confined within the settler-colonial system, where there is an oppressive and dominant settler nation and oppressed and subordinate nations. These subjugated nations undergo a new process in this third stage, partial assimilation, in which their indigenous language and culture is slowly wiped out by integrating these nations within a larger settler society, often out of economic necessity for the members of oppressed nations who have little opportunities within the meager reservations left to them. Displaced peoples and oppressed indigenous nations alike must try to find a new place within settler society, often occupying the bottom rungs of the working class, and have very little, if any, opportunities to advance their quality of life. This assimilation is never completed. This is due to the fact that the bourgeois state relies on divisions within the working class in order to stave off the class struggle by directing the anger of one sector of the working class against the other. As we will discuss, racism reinforces not only the settler-colonial project, but the overall dictatorship of the bourgeoisie as well. In order to understand what constitutes a nation, we must define what we mean. A nation is defined to be historically constituted. It has a common language, common territory, and economic system. It also has a common psychological makeup, all of which manifests in a common culture. There are countries throughout the world which constitute nation states. These are countries which are largely dominated by a single nationality. However, we must also highlight that almost all of these nation states contain within them a sizable minority population, and even the most homogeneous nation states are not completely homogeneous. Even within nations, there are a multitude of smaller cultures, tribes, and clans. Therefore, a nested hierarchy is created where families assemble into tribes, tribes assemble into nations, and nations assemble into countries. Multinationalism is a feature in almost every country, even the most homogenized nation states. This is a result of human migration, colonialism, economic shifts, and the dynamics of politics, warfare, and ecological change. From this, we can derive a basic insight. Settler-colonial societies are multinational, but there is a dynamic of a dominant and oppressive settler nation, oppressing and subjugating the indigenous and displaced nations within its territory. Many have tried to argue that settler-colonial societies cannot be defined as a nation due to this multinationality. What they fail to see is within the settler-colonial project there emerges a new nation, the settler nation. It has its historic constitution from the three stages: conquest and displacement, replacement and settlement, and consolidation and assimilation. The common language is that of the colonizer, English, French, Spanish, etc., as is the economic system and psychological makeup. These are aspects such as racism, settler chauvinism, manifest destiny, etc. Each of these aspects creates a settler-nationalism, which is the dominant culture within the settler-colonial society. It is the division of the world into dynamics of colonizer and colonized, settler and indigenous, that gives rise to the concept of racism. Whiteness became synonymous with the settler-colonizer, and non-whiteness became synonymous with the indigenous and the displaced. However, race is a nebulous term, and the range of what constitutes whiteness has changed over time to include nationalities which have been historically excluded from this category, such as Irish people, Slavic people, and Italian people. This simple categorization of nationality based on skin color is equally nebulous, as there are black-skinned people who have lived in predominantly white countries their entire lives and are every bit as Irish, French, and English as their white counterparts. Race is a purposefully nebulous categorization which reinforces the interest of the ruling class, whether they are an aristocracy or the bourgeoisie, and the definition of who constitutes which race will vary according to the shifting interests of the ruling class. Therefore, race and racism become instrumental tools in the oppression of the working class. This is done in order to create an arbitrary hierarchy separating the white working class from the non-white working class. The inability to scientifically categorize or define race is purposeful and is used as a tool by the colonizer state to suppress and harass members of the out group, to target their communities and engage in state-sponsored terrorism against them, a hallmark of fascist ideology. While class may have specific classifications based on their relation to production, race as a concept is classified by the needs of the ruling bourgeois class. So one may wonder why it is necessary to study race at all if it cannot be specifically defined. The answer is simple. Because racism exists in bourgeois society as a means to divide the working class, we must focus on the racial element of the class struggle in order to understand it in its totality. In short, racism created race, and the concept of race exists because of the concept of racism. The concept of white/settler supremacy emerges and is enshrined, and this racism ripples across the class struggle of settler-colonial society. There are some, unfortunately, reactionary Marxists who consider racial issues to be a distraction from the class struggle. They do not realize that issues of race, gender identity, sexual orientation, legal status, and other identity aspects are intrinsically tied to the overarching class struggle. To focus purely on the struggle of the proletariat against the bourgeoisie and to view the working class as a monolithic entity is to ignore the very real and material differences experienced by different oppressed identities within the working class. More will be discussed on proletarian intersectionality in a future episode, but the important lesson here is that race, in particular, is of vital importance in understanding the class struggle within settler-colonial structures. America began as a British settler-colonial project. During this time, the settler homeland was Britain. The American Revolution can be understood to be a bourgeois democratic revolution in which the settler population of the American colonies, led by the emergent bourgeois class, revolted and gained independence from their homeland of Britain. Therefore, a new settler-nationalism was not a British settler-nationalism, but a uniquely American settler-nationalism. The three-stage process of the settler-colonial project continued to advance and spread the dominance of this newly formed American settler-nationalism across the region we now know as the United States. The common language, English, was inherited by the British settler-colonial project which preceded the American one. The economic system, capitalism, was a result of the emergent bourgeois class which has controlled our society from the very beginning of the American settler-colonial project. The psychological makeup of this American national identity is predicated on separating the settler population and settler culture from the non-settler population and culture. Non-whites became the other, uncivilized barbarians, subhuman savages, and this manifested in a cultural chauvinism and call for manifest destiny and the white man's burden, the belief that it was the duty of the settlers to civilize the non-settlers by advancing the settler-colonial project through its three stages. A patriot is someone who loves their people and their country. Let's examine these two components of people and country. starting with the concept of the American people. Who are the American people? Today we have a concept of a multiracial, multinational American identity where white people, black people, and all other races can call themselves American. The concept of what constitutes an American person has shifted according to the needs of the bourgeois class. Americans are no longer exclusively white, and the scope of this category has now been expanded to those who were born within the borders of the United States or its territories. However, we must not ignore the fact that even if the category of the American people has widened in scope, there is still a bias towards settler chauvinism within our national consciousness. Settler-Nationalism didn't disappear, and the Settler-Colonial project still continues to this day. History has not wiped away the fundamental contradiction between settler and non-settler, colonizer and indigenous, white and non-white. The third stage of settler-colonialism, consolidation and assimilation, is still actively resuming. Indigenous cultures are being gradually erased, languages and customs forgotten, and their particularities are being smoothed out and merged. The black nation within the United States is a perfect example of what happens when a population is displaced and their unique national identities are smoothed out and merged together. Tribal affiliations and mother tongues are forgotten. There's not a distinction between tribal affiliation, there is only the black community. The end stage of the settler-colonial project is the complete assimilation of the colonized and displaced populations into this new national identity. But the necessity of differentiation and settler domination over oppressed nationalities will resume as long as it is useful to the interests of the bourgeoisie. This is why systemic racism still exists. White supremacy has yet to outlive its profitability for the bourgeoisie, as we can clearly see in the prison industrial complex and the overall capitalist system, confining non-white people into lower and more desperate sectors of the working class. The ruling class must maintain an appearance of progress, however, by allowing the occasional non-white person a moment in the spotlight in the form of a black president, non-white CEOs, military officials, and other important societal figureheads. As many have already pointed out, this does nothing to address the fundamental issue of persistent systemic racism in this country, but serves to placate the conscience of the liberal bourgeoisie and petty bourgeoisie who wish to maintain an appearance of progress. Within our conception of the American people, a new differentiating concept is introduced: native-born Americans and immigrants. This category is both inclusive and exclusive. Inclusive in that it allows non-white people to assume the identity of an American, but exclusive in that it draws its distinction according to the geographic location of one's birth. New differentiating categories are introduced by the bourgeoisie, and the scope of the constituents of the American people becomes broadened. But this does not resolve the dialectic contradictions which remain present in American society: white versus non-white, settler versus indigenous or displaced, and native-born versus immigrant. And the antagonisms within these dialectic struggles become dominant or recessive depending on the interest of the bourgeoisie or certain sectors of the bourgeoisie. All of this leads to the realization that the concept of the American people greatly varies and has numerous interpretations. Some would say that the only true Americans are those who arrived in North America from the first initial waves of immigration from Europe. Others say that only white people can be true Americans, and still others say that only those born within the geographic boundaries of the United States and its territories are true Americans. The identity of American, much like the identity of white, becomes purposefully nebulous to suit the interests of the ruling class at different times and in different situations. The artificiality of the notion of the American people is just as artificial as the notion of whiteness. Care must be taken not to assume that because this concept is artificial and nebulous, it means the concept of settler-colonialism is equally artificial and nebulous. The settler-colonial system is very real, very observable. Now we examine the second component of patriotism: a love of country. As we previously highlighted, the settler-colonial projects are multinational, with a dominant settler nationality, Americanism, and a multitude of subjugated oppressed nationalities. These are the indigenous and displaced nations within the U.S. territory. Therefore, the country of the United States is a prison house of nations, where a multitude of nationalities are kept prisoner and gradually assimilated into the dominant settler nation. We have discussed the gradual and oscillating nature of this assimilation, and total assimilation has yet to occur and may never reach completion by design. This should tell us that the United States is still undertaking the settler-colonial project. It has merely continued to advance into its end stage. The assimilation process attempts to mask over historical crimes and historical oppression and excuse contemporary crimes and contemporary oppression. Because of this, a love of America as a country is a love of the settler-colonial project in its current stage of assimilation. One may falsely and naively believe this assimilation is a sign that racism is ending or that the settler-colonial project is over, rather than recognize the process of assimilation as merely the latest stage of the project. In recognizing assimilation, one may propose apartheid as a solution. This is also a fundamental mistake, as the apartheid system is also applied within a settler-colonial framework and reinforces the dominance of settler-nationalism over oppressed nations. Within American history and into the modern day, we can see examples of both occurring. Apartheid and assimilation are two sides of the same coin within the settler-colonialist framework. The goal of total assimilation may never be achieved, and this is purposeful. The bourgeoisie may keep the assimilation process in a permanent stasis, only ever achieving partial assimilation in order to pit one sector of the working class against the other. The homogenization of the working class is a threat to the bourgeoisie. The proletariat, united into a single monolith, would be a force the bourgeoisie could never stop. It is this insight that gives us another definition of the people. The people as the revolutionary masses of the working class. This personhood is divorced from Americanism, divorced from the constraints of the settler-colonial framework, of geographic borders, of racial divisions. It is a personhood rooted in material reality, the proletariat, the means of production. So that about does it for this episode. Thank you very much for watching. Just to review, we talked about the concept of settler-colonialism and its three stages of progression. We talked about the formation of a settler nationality. We talked about race as a product of settler-colonialism. And we talked about the unique particular conditions of America as a settler-colonial project, the formation of the settler-colonial identity of the American people. We also talked about the issues of apartheid and assimilation within late-stage settler-colonialism. And so in the next episode, episode 15, we will talk about decolonization. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know your thoughts down below. Thank you very much for watching. Dinky Kang out.